Welcome back to Chess Lovers channel. My 13th choice of the most influential books for me, middle game book, is this one. The Soviet School of Chess, written by Alexander Kotov and Mikhail Yudovich. And it's very interesting to read the introduction to Dover edition. They have written like this: the Soviet School of Chess is recognized as one of the classics of contemporary chess literature. At the same time, from a strictly political viewpoint, it must be read with considerable caution. So why have they written like this? For example, when we are dealing with names of different openings, for example, we can say Volga Gambit, we can say Benker Gambit, or we can say Makogona variation, or the Tatakova variation, but it doesn't necessarily mean you make a political stance. I'm thinking about, for example, Polygiev's book about the Queen's Gambit defense. And if I remember it correctly, he wrote Tatakova variation. So it's important, I believe, not to exaggerate what name you're using for different openings. It might be some small differences between different cultures. So you should not regard this book as a propaganda machine, because sometimes it's true. Most of the information or knowledge in this book is true. I mean, if I give you a very simple example, for example, this opening is called the Petrov defense or the Russian defense, and this is true. And if we mention another important player in Russian history, Jänisch, he was a very important person because he discovered many new opening lines which he analyzed very deeply and in a scientific way. And he analyzed this variation, which nowadays is called the Berlin defense. But according to this book, it should be called the Jänisch variation. And Jänisch has actually given his name to this opening, Jänisch Gambit in the Royal Office. So this is a matter of vocabulary or terminology. They're talking about names of different openings. Another interesting aspect with this book is that they're writing a lot about Alexander Alekhine. But if you compare it with this book by Nikolai Grekov, Soviet Chess, which is also a very good book, he's not writing anything about Alekhine. This is, of course, interesting, but I believe since Kotov is one of the authors to this book, he has written these books, a book about Alexander Alekhine. So that is the reason this book contains a lot of knowledge about Alekhine. So how is the structure in the book? Yeah, the introduction is very useful to read. And they say here that a keen eye should be used, however, to separate the propaganda from the truth. Of course, believe it, but check it. That goes for all chess literature you are reading. So, how is the book structured? Chapter 1 begins with early history, and here they are mentioned the strong player Petrov, who analyzed the Petrov defense, which I just showed you, and they compare him with Jänisch. Petrov was a much stronger player, but Jänisch was more scientific regarding his opening analysis. And we also have Yudovich, who was Russian chess teacher. And the reason was that he did public lecture and popularized chess. So these three names you should keep in mind: Petrov, Jänisch, and Yudovich. And then chapter 2 is about the founder of the Russian school, Mikhail Chigorin. And I'll show you a picture of him because he's very important to know about. And Chigorin had a different view of how chess should be played, and he had theoretical as well as practical conflicts with both Steinitz, whom he played 2 world championships against. He lost them both, but he was very close to win one of the matches, if it were not that for the fact that he missed a simple mate and 2 moves. Because Steinitz played bishop b4 and lost control of the h2 square, and Chigorin had 2 rooks and could just play rook h2 check, followed by rook g2 with the other rook mate. So we don't know how chess development would have proceeded if Chigorin had won that match, but now Steinitz won. And Tarrasch was very much affected of Steinitz theories and wrote books inspired by Steinitz, and also complemented them with many fundamental rules which Chigorin thought was too dogmatic. And I will show you a very instructive example of this. So in the 17th match game between Tarrasch and Chigorin, they also played a match, but it was not a world championship match. And Tarrasch is white in this game. I will show you the opening. So we have a Roy Lopez, a standard one. But here Tarrasch played knight c3, a kind of 4-knight game. And Chigorin actually played a move here which is inspired by Steinitz to try to hold the e5 square, but the problem is the passive bishop on f8, d4. And now this interesting move, knight d7. Of course, this is breaking fundamental development rules, but it's all about securing the stronghold on e5. And the continuation here was knight e2, because white wants to transfer the knight to the king side and support the center with c3. And now Chigorin played f6 to support the e5 pawn even more. And this can look strange for a dogmatic eye, so to speak, because you are weakening the diagonal, the classical diagonal a2 to g8. But Chigorin has understood that this is not so easy to exploit in practice. So by chasing the bishop on a4 away from this strong diagonal and putting his own bishop on this diagonal, he has solved this problem. And at the same time, the e5 pawn is secure. However, Tarrasch would say that this knight on the edge is not so well placed. And Chigorin agree, but he goes one step further because he says it's not possible to exploit this fact. Nevertheless, White won the game, and I think this position is a key position to understand the main conflict between Chigorin versus Tarrasch and also Steinitz. And we had this conflict already in the 19th century because Petrov criticized Philidor for being too dogmatic. For example, I'll show you that Philidor, who said that pawns are the soul of the game, that is correct. And it's not a dogmatic statement. But what Petrov means is that, for one thing, Philidor thought that White would win by playing correct from beginning to finish, and that is most probably not correct. I mean, the correct conclusion is that the game should be drawn. Steinitz believed it, and also Petrov believed it. But Philidor said that this was a bad move, knight f3, because it blocked the f2 pawn, and Petrov did not agree about this. But then we should remember that Philidor was right in the way that the pawn structure is the most important strategic factor when the position is close, when we are dealing with pawn chains and pawn breaks and so on and so forth. So this conflict between Petrov and Philidor mirrors a conflict between Chigorin and Steinitz, and such conflicts we have had through the whole history. We can even say between Capablanca and Alekhine, and Karpov and Kasparov. So eventually we are talking about different playing styles. So he's talking a lot about Chigorin, the founder of the Soviet chess school. And chapter 3 is talking about Alekhine in depth. And as I mentioned before, Alekhine is not even mentioned in the book, apart from a game he lost to Botvinnik. And that is very interesting because he lived in France. He was a French citizen, and he had conflicts with his home country. And chapter 4, development of the Soviet chess school. And then we have chapter 5, dealing with typical features of the Soviet school, opening, mid-game, and endgame. And the main principle is that they prefer a more aggressive and dynamic game. Even from the opening, one typical position can be among many with White that they want to investigate such a variation. For example, after the normal moves, White is sacrificing a pawn. And of course, White has enough compensation here due to the pressure on the a3, f8 diagonal and exposed queen on e4. So such variations, they like to penetrate deeply, because in this way it was possible to beat more cautious players who mainly played technical chess. So we can say that the Soviet school of chess, beginning primarily with Chigorin, is focused on creative chess, concrete chess. And the reason Chigorin has not been so popular is because it's more difficult to learn from him, because he's much more concrete. So if you go back to Chigorin, the founder of the Soviet school, I show you another example of his openings. Most of you probably know that he could play what it is called the Chigorin variation, breaking the famous rule by Tarrasch that you should never block a c-pawn with a knight, because now it's harder for black to attack this pawn, so black has to attack it in other ways by putting pressure on the knight on f3, for example, with bishop g4. And this opening is fully playable, as for example Morozevich have shown and even wrote a book about. So more eccentric is this variation, the Chigorin variation in the French defense. I have played it myself. I think it's very interesting because it's actually an opening scheme he's introducing here. But the main conflict between Chigorin and Tarrasch was also that he had a different view of the tempo. It looks like black can win a tempo, for example, with knight c6 to d4. But according to Chigorin, it's not that simple. So the modern interpretation of Chigorin's idea would be something like this. So Chigorin's variation in the French is still very much alive today. And this shows a little bit in a nutshell what the Soviet school of chess is all about. Creative chess, aggressive chess, dynamic chess, concrete chess, away from technical chess. So according to this book, technical chess is not according to the spirit of the Soviet school. And a player like, for example, Tigran Petrosyan, he was even criticized for formalism. So David Broncha has said that there is no Soviet school, as the players have different styles. But you could say it is a school in the perspective that there are so many players, so many strong players from one specific country, even though they have different playing style. And this was very clearly shown 1972 when Fischer, which we have here, Petrosyan, Fischer, Geller. When Fischer beat Spassky, he actually beat the big Soviet machine, even the propaganda machine, because there were many political undertones in that match. We continue discussing the structure in this book. The sixth chapter discussing chess literature, it did not impress me especially much. They are talking about fundamental books by, and also more advanced books by Romanovsky, etc. And it's true, those books are very, very well worth reading. And the second part of the book discusses the grandmasters, beginning with Botvinnik, continuing with Smyslov, Averbach, Boleslavsky, Bondarevsky, Braunstein, Flor, Geller, Keres, Korchnoi, Kotov, Levenfish, Lilienthal, Petrosyan, Ragushin, Spassky, Taimanov, Tal, Toulouse. they also discusses prominent masters. So this book covers so many players you can't imagine. Alatortsev, Aronin, Shekhover, Dubinin, Dushotimirski, Furman, Goglice, Ilitsky, Khan, Kasparian, Sholmo, Konstantinopolsky, Lipnitsky, Lisitsyn, Makugonov, Mikenas, Neshmetinov, Novotelnov, Panov, Romanovsky, Simagin, Sokolsky, Veresov, and Yudovich, who is one of the authors to this book, Mikhail Yudovich. And chapter 3, women players, Bykova, Rubsova, Rudenko, Borisenko, Ignatieva, Volsik, Voipert, Svorichina. So this book covers almost all the aspect of the Soviet school of chess. It was this Dover introduction is from 1961. There is actually another book too, the Soviet school of chess, of the same author. But this book would be my recommendation. I have read both very closely, because if you complement this book with Zürich, Norhagen Zürich, 1953, which is also a demonstration of Soviet school ideas, with this book, then you are on the right track. But first you must understand the classical theories, and you must also understand Nimzowitsch theories before you start to read these, what I call middle game books. So this is my 13th recommendation. Embrace it, ignore what might be propaganda, and focus on the truth, because then you have a book which will increase your understanding of how to play chess in different ways, not only classical and prophylactically, but also in a creative, aggressive, dynamic way. Thank you for watching. See you next clip.